would you look at that? Okay, so it is showing. Aha, there we go. And we are live. Would you look at that, the miracle of technology? So I'm going to go ahead and go full screen here. I'm going to first change the layout so that we are tiled. Well, you know what? I don't mind you taking center stage. Let's just do that. Perfect. Okay. So, just so you know what it looks like on this side, and for those viewing later, what you get to see behind the screen that is the Witch Pleas experience. Archie, you are delayed by about like 2 seconds or so on the screen, which is perfect. It basically indicates that we have a bit of a lag time, but we have live chat. We have excellent connection with a little green dot next to it. I think that we could not hope for better. So that means that in the next 7 minutes or so, I figured that we could just talk about how we first came to the idea of this live stream. I have heard from BackerKit that this is an excellent way to engage one's audience and to extend one's reach. And when I thought of your speaking talents, both as an instructor and as a friend, I thought, well, this is going to be perfect. He can talk about all the things that he did in terms of introducing gaming to education. That's going to be our first topic of this particular discussion. So we're going to wait until the audience starts coming in. But I will say in the meantime that, because it's not on our speaker list, that when I was first considering the various seminars to attend for GenCon 2024 Trade Day, yours really stood out, because one of the things that I hope to do is educate through gaming. There are a number of reasons for this. I'll explore them in greater detail when we talk about like the mission of Witch Pleas Publishing and how that originated. But I think that to speak to why yours was so interesting is that it's a precept of ours, a credo of my brand, that, as we say on the website, attributed to Confucius, I read and I forget. Actually, I screwed that up. But you get the idea. So basically what I mean is, and I'm ruining the quote, but I read and I forget. I see and I remember, but I do and I know. Basically that true education comes through engagement on one's own terms with a particular subject. And so though I considered other seminars and speaker engagements at GenCon, like, for instance, how to get gaming materials that are oriented towards education in game stores to be relevant, and of course what some friends of mine, teachers in the dungeon, do, where they're starting up game clubs at schools. I was most interested in, how do you take, in essence, the structure of game mechanics, in your case, Dungeons and Dragons initially, and then use it to educate people. So that's something that we're going to be going into at length. And I think, just as a digression over the next 4 minutes, it's particularly important during an age of AI. And I'm not mentioning AI just to be buzzy, but because I work in an industry that's heavily influenced by AI. I work in the marketing industry, principally. And so, as everybody who's been paying attention to the news, and in particular AI's effect on the economy, has noticed, there's an understanding that a lot of the white-collar entry-level jobs are going to be replaced by AI en masse over the next couple of years. Now, I think it's an entirely separate discussion as to how that influences the economy. Are we going to be moving towards, in effect, a post-work economy? And what does that look like in a lot of ways? But in an immediate sense, it's relevant because, and I feel like I'm not alone in this, there's a question around how is it going to affect people's ability to be creators, to earn a living, whether that's an artist, whether that's a writer, whether that's a marketing strategist, or what have you. Now, I know from my experience, because when I saw the advent of AI coming, I switched from a focus on marketing strategy over to a focus on data management, that AI can be very unreliable. It's like a really enthusiastic little kid that desperately wants to please whoever it's talking with, and it will even bend the truth to do this. Like, even now, we're starting to see that a lot of the AI therapists are kind of falling on their face, because these chatbots will, in fact, lean into people's delusions and neuroses and start endorsing their particular individual or subjective points of view. And so when I saw this brewing up as a concern a couple of years ago, I thought to myself, what is this going to do to education? What is this going to do to our recall of the past? Because if AI, as we've seen, will simply fabricate source material in order to support a particular point of view, unless it has well-organized data that's been popularized, then that means that certain subjects are at risk of losing veracity. They lose it in exchange for verisimilitude. It seems like it's true, and so the AI will use it, but it's not actually true. And so for me, as somebody who loves history and loves original folklore and stories that are sometimes referenced but not actually experienced in their original source material, I saw what we're doing through gaming as a way of popularizing these stories and keeping those original sources alive. And I know that as we approach 2 minutes from when the broadcast starts, your interest has been not only using gaming to educate about, I would say, the practical understanding of philosophical schools of thoughts, but scholarly understanding as well, which is to say that for those of you already viewing, and so far we have no viewers, but those of you watching this live stream after the fact, our material contains actual scholarly excerpts from various materials. So just to start things off, as we were, coming close to introducing this, what are some of the favorite philosophical schools of thought that you want to keep alive through gaming? And so this is kind of a preview to what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah. So you can explore almost any philosophical topic through a game. One thing that I think, gaming particularly lends itself well to is discussions of ethics. In some ways, the fundamental question of ethics is, what should you do? And you might notice that is the fundamental question in an RPG as well. What should you do? What does your character do? Ethics, of course, has a number of theories that prescribe, a particular approach to decision making, whether you're a staunch consequentialist that believes we ought to maximize good consequences through our actions, whatever they may be, or perhaps you're a deontologist who believes in particular moral principles that can never be violated no matter what circumstances. You can bring those approaches, those mindsets to your characters, and you can explore them through characters. I, can think of a number of times when, and I think this is often the case when people design characters, that the characters are quite different from us in many ways, and there might be some ways in which we overlap and bleed into those characters a bit, but very often our characters are quite unlike us. They're the sort of people who go on extremely dangerous adventures for only a promise of reward. Not always having a definite one that is guaranteed, and risking life and limb to do so. And it's always an invitation to think about what you have to be like in order to pursue those sorts of goals. What kinds of moral systems could such people sensibly have in place? And of course, there are a wide variety of games you can play. The sort of character I've just described is what we might think of as a standard kind of dungeon crawling, treasure hunting player character. But of course, games have all sorts of storylines, right? You can play pirates fighting, fascist privateers on the open seas. You can play righteous heroes attempting to, overthrow tyrants. So really, all of these are invitations to think about and engage with moral philosophy, to think about, why is this particular course of action, why is it wrong to be a tyrant? Is it the suffering that they've caused? Is it the unfairness of the situation? Do we appeal to justice? Do we appeal to consequences? These are the sorts of things that you can really dive into if you want to. Of course, lots of people are content to say, hey, there's the bad guy, let's go kill it and have a great time. And that's fine too. But I personally find games to be more rewarding when you get into that kind of discussion, that kind of exploration as well.
Right, and that's something that I really want to explore later in our conversation. But now that we have begun the official live stream, I'm going to check to see how we're doing in terms of people who are watching, and then as such, I'm going to mute myself for a moment. With that, I will begin our official intro, only about 10 minutes late. Thank you all for attending the launch party of Old John Stewart's Mill, the first installment of The Witch is Weird, which is a philosophy-focused campaign for both D&D 5e and Dungeon Crawl Classics. So what is The Witch is Weird? It is, as I say, a beginning adventure. It is for DCC a funnel adventure. And those of you familiar with Dungeon Crawl Classics would know that a funnel adventure is where each player plays a set of level 0 player characters. And these are heroes in the making. These are the ones that are either going to be funneled, which is to say slain during the course of the adventure, is somehow eliminated from play, or will survive the adventure and thereby earn enough experience to become a leveled character, whether that is a warrior, a cleric, a thief, or even a dwarf, elf, or halfling. For Dungeons & Dragons, it's a first-level adventure, and it was initially designed as a first-level adventure by the man sitting here, Archie Fields III, as not only a terrific experience, but also as an educational tool. And this is why it so appealed when I learned of this project, because what Witch Pleas Publishing does is we try and advance education through gaming. We try and find unheard voices, source material that might be at risk of fading away, and bring it into new life and new relevance through gaming. So I would love to start our discussion with a question to you, Archie. In fact, quite a few questions. We'll start with, how did you come up with the idea of introducing gaming to education?
Yeah, so the story actually begins, of course, I've been teaching for a while, I've been gaming for even longer, but the story really starts with my wife, Burley Brumble, who taught a course at the University of Calgary. Over the summer, you can kind of come up with special topics courses that reflect the instructor's interests. Burley and I had been gaming together for years, and Burley thought, well, I'll run a Dungeons & Dragons course, philosophy and Dungeons & Dragons. Burley's course had the kind of traditional philosophy course format of, you've got your readings, you're going to come to class, you're going to get a bit of lecture and a lot of discussion. And Burley pulled in some guest lecturers, friends, people who've written on philosophy and gaming. But eventually, right, the next year, Burley was doing other things, and I asked, well, could I do this course? And so when I got the course, I thought, well, what if? What if I wrote some adventures? What if students actually got to play D&D as part of doing this course? Some students, of course, lots of students who would sign up for the course had played D&D before, but the majority, I would say, even hadn't. They just heard about it. And I realized that when Burley had run the course, was that people were interested in this, but only some of the students had played it. Not everyone had.
Right.
So I thought, well, wouldn't it be awesome? And so in a flurry of creative energy that I have yet to replicate, I wrote a 5-part, 50,000-word adventure over the course of about 5 or 6 weeks, part of which has become the first adventure in the Witch's Weird Adventure Path, Old John Stewart's Mill. And so there are other reasons, I think, to incorporate gaming into the classroom.
Yeah.
But I'll say that's kind of how the course itself came about and was inspired. Was, there's this special topics course. I wanted to take it on, and I thought, man, wouldn't it be cool if students actually play the game? And so summer courses are particularly well suited to this because we were able to kind of, they're often 2.5, 3 hours long each day. So we do a day, students play a game session, we do a day of lecture and discussion, and then kind of go back and forth. I could talk more about the organization of the class later, but that was kind of the general thought.
Yes, and it won't come too much later. I will say what you just said brings up 3 points that I would love to discuss. One is that I love how, as you say, your wife was integral to the inspiration behind this and the opportunity to bring it to a classroom, in that for a number of reasons, but also that my wife has been integral to the inspiration of Witch Pleas Publishing, and that's a story I'll go into later. The second point is that you raise such a good point about how summer courses are uniquely suited to this kind of thing. I was having a discussion just a couple days ago with Teachers in the Dungeon, and they're a pair of podcasters, also GenCon speakers, much like yourself at GenCon 2024. And what they attempt to do is raise awareness for fellow educators about organizing game clubs at their schools. Now, one thing that they noted when I was discussing, which is weird with them, is that it was great for, say, a longer class with shorter amounts of classes, as opposed to what they do, which is a lot of high school education or middle school education. And so the idea of adapting something like the Witch's Weird series, like these modules that are oriented towards education for a high school setting or a middle school setting, was sort of a unique interest of theirs. And I think something that we'll probably explore more as the series comes out, maybe in some sort of exclusive offers. But the third point is the one that you kind of touched on in passing, which is that gaming itself is somewhat uniquely suitable for teaching philosophy. And you had gone into this somewhat during the beginning of our stream as we were preparing to launch. Can you explain some about why you feel gaming is such a great way to learn philosophy, both in a scholarly sense and in a practical sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I talked a little bit about this also at a paper I gave at a conference called Board Game Academics, which is a cool conference for anyone interested in the intersection of gaming and academia. But so I'll begin by talking a bit about a distinction I begin the class by making, which is this distinction between what I'll call philosophy of RPGs and philosophy through RPGs.
Yeah.
So philosophy of RPGs includes questions like, what's a game? Like in just a simple metaphysical sense, what does it mean to be a game or to be playing a game? Are RPGs different in certain fundamental ways from other games? Questions like, are games art? I, of course, tend to think they are, but there are debates in aesthetics about whether anything or whatever counts as art. And so you want to investigate what are the distinctive features of games in which, or that make them art. Another fun question is, what do we owe to virtual persons or imagined characters? The ethics of gameplay, or of storytelling. What is it? Is there something bad that you do when you wrong people in the game? It's up for philosophical debate. So those are all questions, philosophy about RPGs, about D&D or DCC, the experience of playing a role-playing game. There's also philosophy through RPGs, and that is the act of engaging in philosophical thinking, discourse, and learning through the act of playing Dungeons and Dragons, DCC, whatever RPG you like. You can actually, I think, do philosophy by playing a game. So how exactly does that work? Well,
Right.
I'll start, answering that by saying what I did there at the beginning, which is that, in some ways, the fundamental question of ethics in philosophy is what should you do? And as anyone who's ever played an RPG will note, that is also the fundamental question of the RPG. The DM will, or the GM will look at you, or the judge will look at you and ask, what do you do? And so we're confronted with that same kind of decision in our lives where we have to make moral decisions about what to believe, who to trust. We make those in life, guided perhaps by philosophy, in games, guided by what we think our characters' beliefs and philosophy might be. And so it provides an opportunity for exploring those things.
Right. And it's interesting because one element that fascinates me as a game designer is how a system facilitates a kind of narrative and, for your specific application, a kind of philosophy. One other thing I was talking about with teachers in the dungeon, but I basically will bend anybody's ear who will listen about this subject, is how initial D&D rules, basically the actual codified system within the books, facilitate a kind of war game perspective. Because so often, as you and I, old school D&D guys, know, when a party encounters somebody, they do so from an assumption of, I'm going to in some way come in conflict with this person. And if I do come in conflict, I will have to slay them. And if I slay them, I should in turn loot the body. I mean, loot the body has become sort of this phrase that just about everybody who's acquainted with RPGs knows. And yet, to your point about philosophy, in a realistic setting, it's psychopathic to think that way. To encounter somebody and be like, what does this person have to give me? Oh, that's a nice shield they have. Perhaps I'll kill them and take it. That's madness. And I think that a lot of the newer crowd and a lot of the newer systems that I'm seeing introduced are moving away from mechanics that solely facilitate that kind of ethical philosophy and are moving more towards having players collaboratively discuss world creation and their own emotional bonds so that you have that sense of, like you were saying, these virtual characters having a reality of sorts that you are ethically responsible to.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. And there are papers sort of about the ethics of simulated violence and whether there are senses in which we do wrongs, perhaps by, murdering, attacking people in games. Now, of course, these are contentious positions. There are arguments on either side, but it's an interesting question to explore. One thing that I think is really cool about doing philosophy through playing an RPG is in other areas of philosophy. You can have philosophy of anything, philosophy of art, philosophy of science. But very often in those courses, you have to do a bit of work to educate students about the subject you're philosophizing about,
Sure.
or else assume that they have some background in it. And so it's kind of tricky. What's neat about this approach is that students get firsthand experience in the thing you're philosophizing about if they play the game, right? So it's not just an abstract question of, well, what is it like to, consider or immediately consider violence as a viable option in a game. You can actually play the game and think about, well, is this the approach I want to take? And certainly in the Witch is Weird, I want to encourage people to think carefully about their choices and how they approach encounters.
Well, one person that intuitively discerned the moment in The Witch is Weird where you have to make that kind of ethical decision of do I kill them or do I help them is actually in our chat right now. Goes by the name of Judge Crow, and he asks, he's by the way, a fellow creator, one of my favorites, part of Death Guaranteed Games, and also a professor, and he asks, how do you balance the interest in flow of gameplay versus the diversions into philosophy?
Ooh, that's a great question. So when I have sort of given students the adventure, one student will be running the adventure, and I provide kind of a suggested timetable wherein I provide kind of some guidelines about, look, probably the players will, and if they aren't, they should perhaps take some time to discuss the issue, the choice that the party needs to agree on in some sense collectively about what to do in this moment, how to handle these non-player characters, how to treat them, help them, hurt them, as you say. And so my advice there is to kind of let the discussion develop. And I give them some things. The role of the DM in those cases isn't to say, well, this player has the right answer. You know, they're the one who's suggesting we do the right thing. So we're doing, you know, they've figured it out. And so, you know, you all need to listen to them. Their role is to foster discussion if students are having trouble getting into it. So I give them, you know, a few things they might bring up and prompt the players with in the event that they haven't, you know, that they're having trouble really kind of figuring out what the substantive moral issues are. And then I also provide kind of a window of, okay, if it's been, you know, this long, so often, you know, a discussion will go on for, I would say, a good 15 or 20 minutes. But eventually it'll either start naturally petering out, or it will sometimes come to kind of a standstill, and you need to encourage them to work towards some kind of compromise. But that's sort of the guideline, is I write it into the you know, way I give it to the students of, give them time to develop this, but then usher them along, you know, to you know, bring their you know, musings to a mutually agreeable end, so that the game can in fact continue. And I do think it is important, and this is a challenge too of teaching with games, is balancing what we might call pedagogical content with excitement, right? So if you don't have the excitement, you don't get as much investment. And that's part of the big reason to teach through games, is to build student investment. Students were genuinely excited to show up, play a game, and discuss the issues. So if you don't also have some cool, exciting action stuff that they can be excited about also, you know, they might not get as invested. But at the same time, can't be all that, or, you know, your students are, if they're in college, they're paying to just play D&D, which, you know, we don't want, right? We want them to learn philosophy. That's an important goal of the course.
We do. And Judge Crow just commented on it. So in essence, we're talking about framing the natural tendency to table talk to include sort of a moral, ethical, or philosophical dimension. And I would say yes to that, because to speak to specific game design elements that we made sure were in the Witch is Weird publication, made sure were in Old John Stuart's Mill. Number one, there's a certain intuitive understanding that those are stop and pause moments. We don't force your time to philosophize into a moment where there's like hectic combat or merely marching through the wilderness. In specific, the two encounters where we include sidebars about instructors potentially introducing scholarly discussion to the table really are moments where table talk would come naturally. It's basically where there's enough of a question about the ethics of the situation where I think players would be naturally disposed to do so. I would also note that in terms of supplying educators with a framework to have those discussions, if they are evolving naturally but not necessarily within a scholarly context, the time to philosophize moments are indicated in the book itself, and you cite the various schools of philosophical thought that would apply to them. So we don't merely say, hey, it's time to philosophize. You've met these two goblins that maybe you should kill, maybe you shouldn't. We leave it to you. Rather, you cite, deontology, like you said earlier, plays a role in this. Let's consider this from a deontologist perspective. So if somebody's just looking to have a great adventure, it's a natural stop and pause moment for table talk. If somebody is looking to educate through this, you actually have the references. And in the very back of the book, you've written an essay where scholarly texts are in fact cited, and you specifically speak to the philosophical framework within the module.
That's right. And I've included some primary source excerpts there. So you can indeed, if you wanted even, you could print those perhaps, or provide them in some way to your students, because they don't contain spoilers. They just contain the philosophical background, essentially, that you could use. Or, if you're an educator, you might be having them read more, sort of full or complete versions of those texts excerpted. So you might do that as well. But in any case, we've given you a resource you can share with your students so that they are even more prepared to engage in that discussion.
Absolutely. We prepare the educators just as much as we do the gamers in this. Now, that raises really the second question that I had, which I know the answer to, because we talked about this actually at GenCon 2024. But how did you organize the class? Meaning, you are but one man, Archie Fields. You were but one instructor. So you, like you said, poured forth and created this 50,000 word opus for your course. But you weren't going to run it all by yourself. It wasn't just you in front of everybody. I'm sure a lot of us, but especially the educators, would love to know, how did you organize the class in order to execute this in a way that, number one, you could run a game with that many people and be effective about it, but number two, that you had classes dedicated to the scholarly texts themselves?
Yeah, no, thank you for giving me a chance to say something about this. It is one of the questions that always comes up. And because my class was also about 50 people, right? So large-ish class. The answer is I provide a service to the gaming community when I run this class, in that I create 50 new game masters. So yes, indeed, I have the students run the games. So how does this work? Well, in any given class, there's usually at least 10, often more, but usually at least 10 students who have some, even minimal, experience playing RPGs. So I'll typically ask those students to volunteer to run game one. At the same time, I dedicate a class, or a substantive part, not an entire class, but a substantive part of one, to teaching students the very basic mechanics of the game, so that everyone kind of has a basic understanding of how it works, right? That, the D20 roll in D&D is the core mechanic. Here's how it determines success and failure. And really, in the most basic terms, that's the most important thing to understand. Is you ask whether you can do a thing, the DM gives you a number, and then you make a roll to determine whether that succeeds or fails. And then I iterate through lots of examples and help students build their characters. I break the class up into groups of 5 for gaming groups. I'll have one student volunteer to run the first game, so that every other student can kind of get an example of how a game gets run. And I provide them, with the mods, so they have things to say to the players, pre-drafted text and dialogue and stats and everything they need. And then I'm there to answer questions and help if they get stuck. And I'm used frequently in that. Students will raise their hand. I'll come over. They'll say, hey, this person wants to do this weird thing. Can they do that? And then I'll say, well, think about it this way. And then you decide. I always try to leave the GM power in the hands of the student that's running the game. I try not to come in and say, here's how it works. Here's what you have to do. I give them some guidelines and say, here's how you could do it, and maybe give them a couple of options, and then they're off to the races. So that's kind of how I train students to be GMs, and they take to it. Inevitably, by the end, even people who are nervous, they're hesitant to run a game, they're a little worried, but they do it, and they do a great job. And I see everyone at their table having fun, because it's fun to play an RPG with your friends.
Absolutely.
In order to kind of balance the course, as you said, how do you balance those game sessions with more traditional philosophical course methods? We'll usually, after a couple of weeks of just kind of getting students familiar with philosophy, doing that introduction to D&D, we'll then set into a pattern of students play a game in one session, about 3 hours, and then we'll have another 3-hour class session. Again, this is over the summer where you can do that, and it's pre-written into the schedule of the university. We'll have a 3-hour course where I'll do a bit of a recap and lecture, and then we'll discuss the readings the students have done, and we'll discuss the game session they've played in the context of those readings, to give them, to essentially let them revisit the decisions they've made in the game, and ask them to, did we apply this moral theory in the right way? Or if, some students will play through as their characters, and then I'll ask them to analyze what their character did through the lens of the philosophers we've read. So that's kind of the general organization of the course. I hope that has kind of answered that question about organization, some training time, and then alternating gameplay and more typical philosophical lecture and discussion.
Fantastic. Well, my next question is going to be one I think dear to the hearts of a lot of educators, but it's going to be somewhat of a hypothetical for you. It was going to be, how did you get buy-in from the administration? But I can't help but note that in our chat is Nicole Wyatt, as she says, now former department head, who twisted your arm into doing the class originally. Perhaps there's a story there. Perhaps you want to share it with our viewers, but Nicole's here to support this. And she was noting that U of Calgary is a pretty big public university. 50 is a normal size for the course that this was done under. My question, though, is, again, how do you get buy-in from an administration? It seems to me like the administration tried to get buy-in from you to a large extent. But any tips for those who perhaps don't have as supportive an administration to really sell the idea of this kind of an approach to education?
Sure. So there are a few things you can note. One is the tremendous amount of student investment. There's just so much interest in this, and it is a great way really to get students interested in the topic you're teaching through the game. So I had a number of students who were philosophy majors and minors, but I also had lots of students who might not have otherwise considered taking a philosophy course because they were really interested in a course about Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
And so I had tons of reviews, after the term where students were like, I was kind of intimidated by philosophy. I was kind of worried about it. I didn't know if I would like it. But I really got to experience it through this lens of a thing I love and am familiar with. And in doing so, kind of became interested in the philosophy as well that we were studying while playing through these philosophically themed adventures. And so it really can be an awesome way to get students interested in the subject, whatever you're teaching in your
Right.
department. There are lots of subjects you might teach through this kind of approach. I've even heard of people teaching aspects of like marine biology through D&D by talking about ecosystems and things like that. So you really can get creative with it. But one of the things I think, if you are having trouble with administrators, is focusing on student, just how much external, students you otherwise wouldn't have engaged, students you might capture with majors or minors who, otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to philosophy, wouldn't have even considered it. You can get them interested through running a course like that.
And I would love, as an analyst, to run the analytics on that. We often talk in my trade about conversion rates, and I would love to see how much an interest in a course rises, and if gaming is incorporated, and then of those who took it, how many would reply positively to just the question that you asked, whether or not they felt intimidated by the course material at first, but then came to embrace it. Because I feel that one of the great powers of role-playing, in particular tabletop role-playing, where you have that personal engagement, is empathy and finding a common ground and considering from different perspectives. But one thing that's important to note, and this is brought up by Nicole here in the chat, is that she feels it's also helpful to place this in the context of other educational games, like the Reacting to the Path series. So again, bringing in other subject matter. Whenever you're talking to an admin, there are a lot of games, a lot of case studies that really do apply to using gaming for a variety of subjects, some of which were brought up by somebody else in the chat. We'll get to those in a second. What's your feeling on Nicole's comment?
No, I think absolutely it is worth 100% sort of going out, finding those other games that have been used in educational settings, and talking about, the success. There are materials out there. You'll be able to find publications that you can share with your administrators to say, look, this isn't just, right? You can imagine the sort of typical administrator skepticism about this kind of thing, which, is suggested by one of the things I said earlier, like, oh, students are just getting together in a course to play D&D, or getting together in a course to play this educational board game, etc. What you can do is show them there is research out there. There are a number of board game academics is one of them, where you can go and say, no, this is a more common practice than you'd think. Still growing, of course, but people are doing it, and they're doing it successfully.
Right. And as for other subjects that we can apply them to, Lancelot's Cart asked, RPGs are frequently about what you do. Like you were saying at the outset, Archie, what should you do in this situation? And so it makes a lot of good sense to use them for teaching philosophical ethics. But they ask, have you used RPGs for other kinds of philosophy? Now, I know the answer to it. They suggest like metaphysics and epistemology. The answer, just to skip to the ending, is a resounding yes. The Witch is Weird covers a whole cosmos of philosophy. Can you speak to some of the other realms of philosophy that you addressed through the adventure?
Yes. While we do have plenty of ethics, we also discuss philosophy of identity, and in doing so, philosophy of mind. So what are we, right? What are people? What makes us us? Are we our bodies? Are we souls? Are we insubstantial or incorporeal minds? Are we our brains? These are questions that philosophers struggle with and have tried to answer throughout human history, of course. And it's a question we tackle actually in the very next adventure path in The Witch is Weird. So students get to visit an arcane laboratory where they can engage in some strange practices, such as disintegrating their own bodies and perhaps reincorporating them elsewhere in some ways that allow students and educators to explore these questions of identity. We also have an adventure a bit later in the path that asks students to engage seriously with the philosophy of free will, right? What does it mean to have freedom? Is it possible to make free decisions in a world that is otherwise determined? You can also have some fun thinking about the role of dice in that, and thinking about whether actions that hinge on a die roll are any freer or unrestrained than decisions that are fully determined by the laws of physics. And so students get to engage with those kinds of questions in one of the Witch's Weird adventures as well. I'll also note the trickiest one is epistemology, and I have some ideas for future adventures that let students engage with some classic questions about what is belief, what constitutes evidence, and even some philosophy of science. My background in philosophy is philosophy of science, and I have some fun thoughts about how to let students explore issues like the underdetermination problem, about fitting theories with evidence in future adventures. So I do think all of these things can be explored in the context of an RPG. And there's also a bit of epistemology in the very, or in particular in the final adventure in the which is weird as well, having to do with biases that we might bring to engaging with different people, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, and I won't speak too much on it because that truly is a spoiler, albeit one that people will discover if they simply read the book and talk about our NPC backgrounds. But that is one that I brought up during the interview with Teachers in the Dungeon the other day. It's one of my favorites. The bias, because it's not just necessarily a bias towards individuals and how they may seem. That is certainly an element of it. It's also a bias towards how one sees the world. Do you see the world in that, as I would term it, almost a Taoist perspective of, in essence, things are as they are. And that is the only right or wrong to it. In essence, acceptance of sort of that fundamentally true neutral perspective on how the world is organized. And then the other is much more of an artificial construct of a right and a wrong, a good or evil, the self and the advancement thereof. And that, I feel, is really a fundamental conflict in the course of The Witch is Weird. If I was to predict how people run this campaign, I feel that that's where the most tense dichotomy will exist. Those drawn between, I'll give this much away, the more perspective of the witch, and in essence, leaving things to the natural flow of fate, and Gansvargel the Bard, who believes in a much more heroic tradition of self-advancement, self-aggrandizement, a truth that is, in effect, created rather than essential to existence.
Yeah, nice. No, that's without getting too much into the details. That's a good way to think about it.
Well, being a co-creator, I am exhilarated to work with you because you are just a constant foment of ideas and ways to apply philosophy. I will say to the viewers that one thing that we incorporated in Which is Weird that I don't believe was present in the original form was that we have little philosophical encounters. So part of what we as Witch Pleas usually bring to our modules is rich campaign setting details. I'm a big believer in that kind of full experience of a role-play environment. So you should know what the food tastes like. You should know what the streets smell like. You should know distinctive features on the houses, or in Greenspire's cases, the fact that it's surrounded by these enormous cracked emerald shards of an elven city's ruins. But we also include encounters that have philosophical elements as well. Can you speak to some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a really fun thing we've included. It is a thing that gives, if you're an educator, it gives you some additional things. Like suppose, as occasionally happens, students will blaze through an adventure even faster than you expect, you can pull one of these out to let them get a little more discussion in. So, for example, there is one encounter you can have with a wily merchant who will run the Sorites paradox, or the paradox of the heap, against the players, promising to sell them a whole heap of something that they desire. Perhaps it's a heap of some supply, a heap of potions, whatever, and they'll say, "I'll sell you this heap." If you're watching and you know this paradox, you know exactly where this is going. Through a philosophical principle called mathematical induction. Essentially, you can start by saying that if, let's say 100 potions is a heap, then 99 potions is a heap, right? 100 potions is a heap, therefore 99 potions is a heap. It's a deductively valid argument that you can run again and again until you're left, seemingly with the absurd conclusion that 1 or even 0 potions is a heap.
Right.
Which will, if you've ever, for all of the people who are experienced game masters out there, you know that players are going to lose their minds if you say something like that, where you're like, well, I've taken a bunch of your money. I'm now going to sell you a potion or even no potions and propose that I have sold you what you asked for, a heap of potions. And so students can then engage in picking that apart and trying to think about criteria of definitions, right? And thinking about whether, just because it might not be possible to say, well, here's the exact point at which you draw this line, that doesn't mean that the category itself has no meaning, or that you can say that there exists, that this too counts as a heap. So students can engage in a bit of logic, a bit of philosophy of language. There are also questions about divine command theory, the will of the gods. The gods are always an important role, or play an important role in Dungeons and Dragons games and DCC RPG games, I believe, as well.
Right. Yeah.
And so thinking about whether an action is right, or your characters would believe something is right just because a deity wills it so, is another fun question to engage with. There are some other examples in there. There are some Ship of Theseus type problems too. But that's just to say we've really included all of these extra side quests as fun encounters players can have that will provoke thought, and hopefully provide some additional fun and challenge as well.
Yeah, because ultimately, even though there's a lot of established materials in terms of campaign settings about where a fantasy RPG can be set, meaning, you have Waterdeep and you have Baldur's Gate, you have, and of course I'm listing D&D properties. In the case of DCC, you have the various cities of Aerith and Punjar and so forth. The availability of that to game masters is, it's iffy. They're not in the core rule books. You usually need to buy supplements in order to get those information. And so a lot of game masters will incline themselves towards a homebrew kind of setting. And so what we hope to do in producing these adventures is have a campaign setting. So if somebody wants to set an entire campaign in Greenspires, they're not restricted to the events in The Witch's Weird. You can use Greenspires being a frontier town as the site of a larger campaign where you explore the Hinterwoods, the surrounding areas, and yet use those various elements as these ways of keeping the philosophical pulse alive, so to speak. So, let's talk some about game design, if you don't mind. I know I tossed you a few questions that you might want to ask me. Why don't we turn it around and I'll start asking or answering rather your questions?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm interested to kind of hear some of your responses to a couple of things I have in mind as well. But first, I guess I'll just start with, I, of course, had these adventures. They were designed for this classroom purpose. You've got your own kind of world proprietary to Witch Pleas Publishing, the world of lore. And so how did you come to what drew you to my games, to the Witch's Weird Adventure Path, as a thing to be set in lore?
Yes, I would say 3 simple reasons with an addendum. We'll get to the addendum at the end. One, somebody in the chat brought up earlier, and I alluded to it, when Lancelot's Cart talked about applying RPGs for other kinds of subject matter. Now, I had started off Witch Pleas Publishing along with my wife because we had what I considered to be, as a marketer, a rare opportunity through Goodman Games to give you a little bit of a background on how Witch Pleas Publishing started. It was because in 2023, I was running a 5e campaign that was largely centered around that kind of old school Temple of Elemental Evil setting in the village of Hamlet, and I had become so enamored with it, and I was doing so much world building supporting that. I said, you know what, I would love to get this out there and publish it as an adventure. I know as a marketing professional how to structure the content effectively, and perhaps even to get somewhat of a marketing network going. And so I reached out to Goodman Games, who had done the Temple of Elemental Evil as an adaptation, basically, as a 5e version of the old module. And I said, I would love to have my adventure as part of this canon of Temple of Elemental Evil and Village of Hamlet. Do you have the license? And they said, well, we can't extend the license. And in fact, I had learned at that time that Greyhawk was one of the few settings at that period that Wizards of the Coast was basically saying, no go, you can't do anything in that setting. But then Goodman Games said, we will, if you do something for DCC, for Dungeon Crawl Classics, market it for you or assist in the marketing through extending it through our newsletter and so on and so forth. And I knew what value that was as a game designer. And I cite this whenever game designers ask me about the value of Dungeon Crawl Classics or any of the Goodman Games title, that they are such a supportive organization in terms of their third-party publishers in that regard. And so given that kind of opportunity, I had to sit down with my wife, Gina, and I basically was like, okay, what's our why here? We can't just say we're doing it to make cool stuff. I don't want it to just be like my fan fiction to Village of Hamlet, but with a facelift or, a superficial change. And again, I came to that realization that in an era where original records are becoming increasingly elusive or bastardized because of how we receive information, it was all the more important to really cite core source material, whether that was literary or folklore or poetic or historical, or in your case, philosophical, and then make it accessible to people through gaming. In essence, find a different way of educating than simply sitting somebody down and saying, here, read Spencer's The Fairy Queen. I don't want them to read Spencer's The Fairy Queen. I want them to play Spencer's The Fairy Queen, and after they've defeated some foes in it, be able to look at the original source material and say, that was accurate. And I've learned something about that era and about that piece of literature that I'm going to take away with me because I've made it my own. I've made it a part of my own story. And so with that as sort of the spirit of Witch Pleas Publishing, when I saw what you were doing with philosophy, I said, oh, this is ideal. The other aspect is that, put plainly, when I read your material, it was quite excellent and it fit the world of lore. Lore is in essence a light fantasy, medieval or early medieval, meaning Viking age kind of setting. So by and large, we don't have people riding around with like legions of full plate armor, carrying cannons. It's not late Renaissance. And it's certainly not like the Dark Ages where everybody is just like scrambling in this kind of like post-imperial apocalyptic situation. Civilization is largely established, but it has not encroached fully onto the wilderness. And so there's still that dichotomy between society and the natural world, between what would be usually characterized as pagan beliefs and more organized institutions of religion. It's that exciting dichotomous time. And in many ways, I felt that what you'd produced for what ultimately became The Witch's Weird spoke to that, because Greenspires, as I say, it's a frontier town. You've established that from the beginning. It's right there on the ruins of this elven civilization, which has its own history, which very well connected with what I'd established through lore. And so I said, well, all the perfect fit is there. The addendum to this is that it's just been terrific working with you. Like, I don't want to give too much away because I know that your time is at a premium, much like mine. But for those privileged to work with you, it's just been a joy. Your enthusiasm, your energy, your sophisticated approach to applying different perspectives of thinking to any situation, and yet not getting bogged down in that, has made you like an ideal co-creator. So those are the three reasons that I thought you were great.
Well, thank you so much. That was extremely kind, and I greatly appreciate it. And I can only say, Matt, that it has been very excellent. Just truly a wonderful experience working with you as well. From our first sort of encounter at GenCon, where we, got to sit down and chat. And I think we both we had other things that we had thought we were going to go do, but we just got so engrossed in that conversation that we, suddenly found ourselves looking and being like, oh, shoot. So no, it's just been truly wonderful collaborating with you to bring this to life.
Thank you. Do you have any further questions for me?
Yeah. So you've said a bit now about this kind of setting of DCC and lore as well.
Yes.
Could you, just on the subject of lore, could you say a little bit more perhaps about, especially for people who are unfamiliar with, the sort of things that make it unique as kind of a campaign setting as a world?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I would say is unique about it is that it is a light fantasy setting that really speaks to the deep canon, meaning the evolution of folklore, in particular civilization's perspective on the spiritual world. And I guess that's kind of a highfalutin way of saying that I didn't go down the road of high fantasy D&D or even something like a Tolkien style setting, because in both of those settings, magic is rife. And there has never been a time in human history where, in fact, the use of magic in a practical and effective sense has been that prevalent and that real. However, there has most certainly been a time where in the history of our folklore, our belief in magic and our actions based on that belief have been prevalent. There have been times where we are led to believe whole civilizations of people jumped into boats for the sake of Odin and then just rowed off into a blank hemisphere of water in order to discover new lands for the sole purpose of doing something basically pillaging, like finding a new land and conquering it for the sake of these gods that they believed were rather psychopathic plunderers themselves. And that stretches back all the way to when, if we look at early beliefs, like for instance, early Greek mythology, or again, Norse mythology, the notion of the world's creation was not similar to that monotheistic construct that we find in the Bible, where, as we all know, in the Old Testament, it talks about like there was void and then God said, let there be light, and everything got organized by some sole deity. It was actually, if you look at the Greek mythology, if you look at Norse mythology, and in fact, several other world mythologies, there were these primordial beings that predated the gods. They were the Titans or the giants or what have you. And so you have in many of these mythologies much, and I think Norse mythology is probably the best example of this, or Germanic mythology as well, a host of beings that had ancient power, in fact, able to trump that of gods and of civilization. And I think that that's probably the most distinct aspect of lore, because it's a world in which, much like we are led to believe people lived in, say, the Dark Ages or the Viking Age, where people believe in magic, even though it's not all around you. And we'll see this develop not only implicitly through our adventures, but also through the campaign setting material that I'll be working on probably next year and perhaps into future years. And in that, clerics and wizards and so forth are not on every corner. When you have somebody who's capable of casting magic, it gets around. Like, this is a big thing. You know, it's accepted that that's the way the world works. It's not like if a wizard showed up today and started casting fireballs in Times Square. Like, they accept in lore that these happens, that there are dragons and elves and magic and so forth, but it's not everywhere. And so it gives that sense of specialness as well as authenticity to the time period. And then it tracks back to a way in which, as I alluded to, the cosmos kind of diverges from what many fantasy RPGs embrace as cosmology or origin myth, which was, in their cases, there were gods, and they made the various multiversal planes of existence and so forth. And then from there down, you have giants and elves and so forth. In lore, you start with the giants, and you start with the elves and the dwarves and the goblins and all these various chthonic creatures, as they say. And they are the ones that, at least somewhere in their history, they held the true power. And then the gods were created. But just as in Norse mythology or Greek mythology, the gods ultimately usurped those older orders and so forth. And so though there is magic in the world of lore that can, in fact, ensnare the gods or manipulate their power, that lived in the forges of the dwarves or in the weave of the elves or in the wisdom of the giants, those things have largely been lost to time. And that's the world in which we live. And so there's that deep lineage that speaks to, as I say, how mythology evolved throughout human history, and at the same time differentiates itself from that usual cosmology of divinities at the top and then other orders.
Very cool. No, I love that, and it's such a fun way to think about structuring a fantasy setting, to give it that kind of, you know, in a sense, a historical feel, a connection to human history and human-created mythologies as they've historically occurred. I also want to make a connection between something you've just said and something that came up earlier. Which is, you know, we talked about the adventurer in, you know, standard dungeon crawl, in a standard dungeon crawl sense, is kind of psychopathic in a sense of like, well, we're going into immense danger. We're planning to, you know, if we have to, kill some people to take their stuff. Right. And of course, right, that exact same language came back up when you were talking about, you know, historical practices at this time. And so I just want to connect that to something I said earlier about the what's interesting about teaching philosophy through a role-playing game is what another scholar, C. Tai Win, calls adopting alternative agencies as a key feature of games, in which you take on other perspectives and goals that aren't your own temporarily for the sake of playing a game, with the aim of which can be to entertain, to have fun, to achieve some other goal. But I just want to note that that's also just a key skill in philosophy, right? Is being able to try and inhabit another position. We often refer to it as the principle of charity, wherein you try to think about, you know, when you are debating with someone, when you're trying to, or you're critiquing their position, you try to also come at it from their perspective to understand and interpret their claims in the most charitable way possible, so that you're not creating, for example, a straw person version of their claims. Yes. And what's interesting about, you know, doing that is even when, you know, we see behavior that, you know, we might regard as like, you know, absurd or psychopathic or something, we can still try and understand, well, what would be motivating? What could the conditions of, you know, historically have been like, such that this seemed to be a reasonable course of action? And in doing so, you know, expand our minds just a bit, even into territory that, you know, we think, well, you know, how could these people even have been people?
Right.
And then right, that brings you to in some cases the uncomfortable realization that they are in fact people, and people are capable of some pretty horrific things. And that is also important to keep in mind, that we are not so distant from that past that it's not a real concern even today.
Precisely. And it's so interesting that you bring that up. It brings two things to mind. And in our chat, Dad Thulu defined it as adopting external agencies and noted that much of the worth of it is a cornerstone of developing empathy and understanding. And I think that the two things would come to mind for me is, one, I've seen role-playing games have actually created social bonds and developed social skills that wouldn't have otherwise existed because of, as you put it, that charitable approach. Another person that I know of has called it generous assumptions, which is basically where you extend your sense of generosity to include that this other opposing viewpoint might in some way be valid to that person, and then to analyze the reasons why. And I had a discussion with a fellow who's in charge of a group called Educators for Excellence. And when I was talking to him about education and gaming intersecting, and after I had talked about The Witch is Weird, I talked about Campfire, which is another intro RPG game that Witch Pleas Publishing recently released. And he said to me, looking at what is being taught in schools today and looking at the cultural climate, the most important thing through a gaming experience would be, as Dad Thulu put it, adopting external agencies, would be, as you put it, developing that charitable approach. And in fact, a game that in essence localized various issues and yet gave characters opposing viewpoints and agendas and tried to come to a position of mutual solution through mutual respect. And I really couldn't agree more with that particular assessment. It is, I think, a pet project that continues to play on my mind that we could somehow introduce, maybe as a mini game or maybe as a feature of what we develop. The second thing is, I have to say, and then I will hand the microphone, so to speak, back over to you, that in my callow youth, well before the concept of a session zero came in, I ran a Call of Cthulhu campaign that was set in Germany during the wartime years and so forth, for the very reason of adopting some very uncomfortable external agencies on both sides of what I consider to be probably the most heartbreaking conflict in the early 20th century period, at least for Western Europe and so forth. Because, as you say, when we analyze, when we accept that people are not fundamentally different now than they were beforehand, but that the culture has significantly changed and the paradigm has significantly changed, we're able to analyze the reasons by which incredible evil and callousness and racism and so forth come. And I know, as somebody who is deeply troubled by those things, that I support that analysis because that allows us to detect where the roots or where the seeds of that begin to stir in a context that it's probably not the same as history, because history, though I believe it to be somewhat cyclical, does change, but rather allows us to see how these things are sort of blossoming anew and to, take action against them, really.
No, yeah, that's great. And Hannah Arendt, of course, writes about this as the banality of evil, where sometimes, right. Sometimes the only thing needed for really horrific things to happen is for people to just do their jobs, right? To be given a task by someone else and to say, well, this is what I'm doing, and that's just what I need to do. If any viewers are unfamiliar with Hannah Arendt, I recommend going.
Dig into that, yes, especially topical, yes.
Yeah. But no, great. Well, another thing, we've touched on this also, but I wanted to sort of get a bit more about this in terms of the aim of Witch Pleas as sort of a publishing company. And you've mentioned that, you know, part of what you're doing is to educate and entertain. I thought you might say a bit more about that, and maybe how that's happened in some of what you've already published, because I know that they were inspired by, learning about literature. Which I thought was really fun. My undergraduate education was actually a double major in English and philosophy, and so the study of literature has always been close to my heart. So I love that was one of the first things I think that you pursued, and I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I really wanted to find works that, in some cases, were yet to be fully popularized, maybe fringe sources. In some cases, were popular in a superficial sense, like we knew of them, but people actually didn't read the source material very much, and that always had an element that would question the paradigm. So the whole concept of Witch Pleas, as my wife inspired the mission, is to give voice to the voiceless. And so, as I say, these could be lost voices, these could be marginalized voices, but these are ultimately voices that are unconventional and that question our view of things. And so the series of A Tale of Two Sisters originated because I'm a big believer in the marketing strategy adage of start small, fail small, with a little humble zero-level adventure for DCC, which was called Champions of the Goblin Market. And as the name suggests, it was inspired by a very long poem by Christina Rossetti called Goblin Market. Now, for those of you that don't know Goblin Market, it's a lovely Victorian poem that tells the story of two sisters who are being tempted by goblins to go away and taste this addictive fruit, and that one sister succumbs and the other one, in essence, rises to the occasion and recovers her sister and brings her back, which I thought was a pretty sound dynamic, especially because I really wanted to tell the story of a female protagonist's rise to become a hero. But to my point about an unconventional voice, Rossetti's poem really was an analog or a metaphor for resisting toxic masculinity that was well before its time. I mean, we're talking like, unless I'm completely wrong, I'm only going to be off by a few decades. We're talking around the era of the American Civil War, that somebody was writing a story about, like, look, there are going to be these guys. They seem perfectly attractive in some ways, repugnant in other ways. You're going to feel this draw to them. If you go and do what they say, it's not going to end well. You're going to get shunned and sick, and it's demented and so forth. So listen, let's just look to the relationships that you have that are healthy in your life and resist that. So again, Goblin Market being this metaphor for the attraction of these toxic masculine qualities and so forth, I was like, okay, this is the story that I want to tell. And so it began the story of the Thistledown sisters, as I call them. Maddie, who is spirited away by the goblins, and Kylie, who becomes the hero to save her. But another thing that I wanted to do in terms of Kylie's development into a hero is, A, as I said earlier, have source materials inspiring the adventures that always question the conventional perspective, and B, also through that show that her rise to heroism is a very, very painful process. So that goes back to, in essence, that question of what do we owe to the virtual characters in a game. And having a recurring PC and having, in essence, a framework whereby that PC reacts emotionally and psychologically to certain circumstances grounds the play in a certain emotional verisimilitude. Because if I had just written 5 adventures that were basically like, you're going to start off, it's a fun adventure, a bunch of people are going to die, and then, a few adventures later, you're 4th level, and you can, call down fire from the sky, and you have the powers of a god, and if you're a warrior, you can, be untouchable and slaughter a whole village. That's a typical DCC narrative. I'm running one right now, and it's a hell of a lot of fun, let me tell you, in a certain sardonic way. But it's not emotionally realistic. And so, in many ways, Kylie is kind of the emotional center of the work, because in the first one, the loss of her sister, in the second one, the loss of her family, because she becomes estranged from her family for the choices that she makes to try and go off and become a hero. In the third one, basically giving up the conventional way of living and the dream of what we would characterize as like the American dream of having a home, having friends around you, living a slower paced life, and instead embracing life of an adventure where you're sleeping in the rough most of the time, and you're learning how to do all these despicable things like cut somebody's throat from behind, or like disable a trap that could explode with poison and so forth. And then finally, the last two installments where she's become hardened by the process, and then finally has to, again, spoiler alert, sorry, Lancelot's cart said no spoilers. He's no longer in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead. In the last one, she actually has to face her sister, who's bringing the goblin's wrath upon the town that had abandoned her and so forth in Feast of the Goblin Winter. So that story is one that I wanted to tell because in my experience, one of the most fascinating narratives is the hero's journey. And yet, so often, even in good modern works, the surface of that is only scraped. And we don't realize, like we do in the real world, if we look at soldiers who've gone off to war or first responders, the psychological impact of those decisions. I mean, they often talk about how it's so difficult being the spouse of a law enforcement officer because of what that person brings home, because of that person, in essence, having people, for many different reasons, lie to them all day long, because of the long hours and all these other, in essence, factors that break them from the conventional mode. So that story I just very much wanted to tell. And then to go back to the source material, just to do sort of a quick run through of the ways in which I sort of questioned the paradigm. The second one was called Pilgrims of the Goblin Road, which is a pilgrimage. It was inspired largely by Chaucer's approach. And I love Chaucer's approach to storytelling in Canterbury Tales, where you have these different backgrounds coming together. It's a first level adventure for Dungeon Crawl Classics. And why this is significant is because usually Dungeon Crawl Classics campaigns go from you survive the funnel, and now you have all these amazing powers, and you're off on the road. You're just like going out there, and you're going to find treasure and kick ass. And there's never really an explanation of why these people made a choice of surviving this terrible experience of the 0 level and then becoming adventurers. It's just assumed that they did. But Pilgrims of the Goblin Road has what we call a roster of reasons, which speaks to that sort of Chaucerian approach of storytelling where everybody has their own backstory to share. And so if you're a participant in Pilgrims of the Goblin Road, you consult the roster of reasons and you say, well, this is my particular reason. Some of those reasons being secret. Some of those reasons having conflicting agendas, in fact. So that's how I brought Chaucer into that. And again, question the paradigm of how do you play a proper role-playing game, a proper like first level adventure. The second level adventure is Pirates of the Goblin River. In that one, I wanted to bring forward this notion that pirates and piracy extends well into the past when it comes to the literary canon, and in fact, the canon of fantasy. One would even argue that the Odyssey is a bit of a pirate story because they're just roaming around, like either discovering islands or raiding islands or seeking treasure, and he's kind of trying to get back home, but he's kind of not. And, you're having all these phenomenal adventures. And also to speak to Beowulf, which was most definitely an unrecognized pirate story because it's the story of this crew coming from, in essence, all the points of Germania and Scandinavia and forming up to go and find this monster and defeat it, in essence. And so the pirates in that you face, because the Pirates of the Goblin River are not the PCs, they're the PCs' opponents, they're an actual group of adventurers from all points of the world that have backstories. And so, to your point about questioning that kind of psychopathic point of view, the adventure starts off where the PCs enter this tavern. They are unaware that they are marked for death by this other group of adventurers, and the adventurers descend upon them and attack them. And so the first battle is really adventurer party versus adventurer party. And one of the great things that happens because of that backstory that we put into Pirates of the Goblin River is that it is a brutal fight. I knew that from my knowledge of game mechanics. Usually at least 1 or 2 PCs is downed in the process. But when they win, there's that wonderful surge that players get of like, we did it! Like, somebody's still standing and they're all laid out. And then they do what they always do, Archie, like we were saying at the beginning, they loot the body. And on each body, I put one little sad personal effect of the backstory. Letters from the mother to the thief. Come home, like there's still a place for you. I still set a place at the table for you. little statues that this one woman has carved of her children and so forth. And it goes from that sense of like triumph to a sense of just being emotionally crushed as you realize, like, I just killed valid human beings. Like, what did we do? And now there are still survivors of that party, and tracking them down and unfolding the story of that party is integral to the exploration of the setting, of the map, in essence. And so that continues to unfold. But I always love the dynamic of that. And then finally, in the last two, we have Midsummer's Night's Dream, largely inspiring Hunters of the Goblin Grove, which is an exploration of a place that features prominently in Which is Weird, which is the Hinterwoods. It's basically the sprawling primeval forest that's well known to the Fae folk because of millennia of their own society there, but has become only recently invaded by people. And so in Hunters of the Goblin Grove, the PCs step into that realm, the untraveled Hinterwoods on Samhain night, on, in essence, Halloween, when the barriers between the worlds are at the thinnest, much like with Midsummer. And like in Midsummer's Night's Dream, there's a lot of transformation that goes on, a lot of illusion. There are mechanics whereby the game master has so many charts at their disposal that they could constantly be rolling like new kinds of encounters and oddities and wonderments that happen. And in fact, the way that the PCs progress through the map is determined not based on some sort of a linear map that they can navigate, but rather through the trees that they choose to go through from one area to another, and the lore that surrounds those trees. As for instance, hawthorn trees were believed in Northern Europe to be the sort of home of the fairies. And so if you go through the hawthorn trees into another area, you get this very fairy-like experience. You know, it's like there's trickery, there's illusion. On the other hand, if you go by way of the yew trees are associated with death and darkness. You know, like the yew wand was, I think, featured in the Harry Potter books. It's like a particularly dark wand. And my point to all that being that if you go the yew path, you go, in essence, into like a land of the dead, you know, and everything's rotting and corrupted. And there are these psychopomps and trolls and undead creatures and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, if you go the oak route, that's the high elves. The oak was the sacred root and so forth. And so that's the happier experience, if you will. And I leave it to the players to learn this kind of system of navigation and to assemble the puzzles necessary to complete the adventure. And then last but not least, certainly not least because it clocks in at around 80 pages. It's huge. It's got a huge campaign setting. Basically everything that I developed in terms of the campaign setting for that archetypical frontier town, Thorpe is what I call it, because Hamlet was, you know, Hamlet by another vowel, as it were, and Thorpe is, you know, Thorpe with an extra E on it. And it is a town that in this adventure is attacked, as I said, by Maddie Thistledown, now in her incarnation of the Goblin Princess, and she's got this brilliant plan of attacking them right on Yule. And so this Yule ceremony is taking place when all of a sudden the spirits of winter descend. Now, the thing that I did to challenge the paradigm there, largely because it was based on a lot of legendary that connects back to the ancient people's beliefs in the incarnations of winter. So we have like the boar as an incarnation of winter, you know, because in a lot of the Germanic mythos, it was the boar that slew the sun god or the sort of messianic figure who would then rise again in spring and whatnot. So there's the giant boar, there's like the dark witch who represents the crone figure and so forth. Well, all of these are boss fights, effectively. And one thing that always happens in DCC, and I mean always happens, is that when you get to a higher level, sometimes even at a low level, if there's a really, really tough fight, the wizard or the spellcaster in the party, sometimes it's an elf, will do what's called spellburn. And for those of folks out there that are unaware of what spellburn is, it's a mechanic in DCC where you burn points of your physical stats, kind of like in a story, as we understand conventional fantasy narratives, where the wizard is like exhausted. You know, she like slits open her arms and bleeds fire, or like she pours out her energy and then collapses. That's basically spellburn. And usually in DCC, when the chips are stacked against the PCs, that wizard's going to spellburn. And she's going to burn like a bunch of her strength and her agility and her stamina, and then she's going to, in essence, be a shell of herself. But if you do that in this, there are lots more boss fights to fight. You can't win the adventure simply by like spell burning, beating the big bad, and then calling it a day. And in fact, a lot of these various scenarios, these various boss fights, lean in to the abilities of one class, say a cleric being able to turn undead, meanwhile negating another class's abilities to an extent. Like, for instance, using anti-magic fields. So there's a great deal of strategy to it. It is not an adventure that's meant to simply be like one right off the cuff. Like, you really need to try and be clever about it if you're going to win Feast of the Goblin Winter, which I thought to be appropriate because it's winter. It's got to be the toughest time of the campaign. And if you survive it, then hey, you're 5th level and congratulations, you've achieved something amazing. So that is the established Witch Pleas canon. I will say that we have one more module coming out in a matter of days, just a month and 2 days. July 19th is DCC Day. And we were lucky enough to have a module called All Roads Lead to Conquest that is coming out in all stores that participate in DCC Day. For those of you that don't know, DCC Day is where you can go to the game store and get a free module. You can also get modules at a reduced rate, and we're offering a version of Champions of the Goblin Market, since it's our introductory module, at a reduced rate that people can buy. But the free offering, as I said, is called All Roads Lead to Conquest. It too is a funnel adventure, but Archie, it's completely unlike Which is Weird or Champions of the Goblin Market or any other funnel, because it, like we were saying at the outset, uses different mechanics, albeit within the like overarching rule system of DCC, to have different narratives. The scenario is this. Because you're a bunch of level zeros, you're not yet heroes, you're in your village that's going to be absorbed by this marauding army of northerners and these hoary-beard Vikings who are just storming down onto your town, backed by a bunch of dragons, and you need to get out. And the village elder says, well, there are 3 courses to get out. Either A, you can go through the mountains, which nobody has ever done because it's infested with monsters that live in this ancient ruins. You're pretty much going to have to hack your way through the opposition to get through there. Or B, you could go through this tomb that's basically where the gods have entombed their own kind. And definitely nobody gets out of there. But the legends say that directs to another place. Or you can simply allow the army to capture you and then try and find a way out. And each of these has different kinds of narratives. So the combat route is very conventional DCC. You got some puzzles. There are tactical challenges. But on every fight, I didn't just make it like the party versus a foe in the standard, like, let's mob them and see who dies and who lives. That's usually how funnel adventure combats go. Everybody in the funnel party just kind of rushes the enemy, and the enemy kills a bunch of people in the funnel, and then we'll see how it goes. But rather, there are conflicts against hidden opponents, conflicts against swarm opponents, conflicts against multiple opponents from different directions who are on difficult terrain. There are all these kinds of tactical challenges. So if you choose the combat route, you're going to get a pretty engaging experience, even if you're a veteran combatant in the role-playing sphere. If you're going to go the route of the puzzles, going through that ancient tomb, it really is just working your way through almost like a Tomb Raider or an Indiana Jones experience where you're trying to figure out what the riddles and the puzzle configurations of the environment are. And if you do so, then you survive. But anybody who fails the puzzles is pretty much sure to die. Like, the level of lethality is very high. And then we come to my favorite. I call it the Path of Cunning. And if people allow themselves to be captured by this army of northerners, it then becomes a social game, whereby the party is divided between the camps of the various thanes of this army, the various lords and ladies. And they come to learn that the lords and ladies don't really like each other. Some are in love, some hate each other because they're in love with another person in the camp and so forth. And so learning their secrets and then learning how to manipulate them by stealing certain objects or spreading certain rumors is the game, because you can't fight them. They're an entire army of high-level Vikings, and you are but one's level 0. But if you listen and you learn and you use your social skills well, with a little bit of luck, you get through. And so it's like we were saying at the outset, it really is a paradigm that uses the DCC mechanics, but in a way that's entirely new in terms of the narrative that it fosters. So all of those are a part of the Witch Pleas line. And I mean, it's suffice it to say, it has been, I'm out of breath, a hell of a journey since 2023. Like, here I am almost 2 years into it. And we have Witch is Weird coming out today, the start of a great journey and all this other stuff that we've accomplished. So it's been great.
Fantastic. Yeah,
Thank
well,
you.
bringing it back around to which is weird. What did you find? I originally, wrote this in 5e
Yep.
and imagined it as 5e game, but we adapted it to DCC as well.
Right.
What do you think is really cool about kind of the DCC version
Right.
of this? Yeah.
Well, the simple answer to that is I love how we've brought curses and blessings hand in hand to the experience. For an old school player, or I think anybody who loves a darn good narrative, having a blessing have a downside to it always makes for a better story. So, as a for instance, again, this is kind of a spoiler, but Gans blesses the group, but Gans's blessings come with a bit of a downside to them. They come with a bit of a cost. And it's a way in which a 0 level character who's just beginning their journey as a hero can have a defining trait linger with them that was instilled by this experience. And so it makes the experience of going through old John Stuart Spell more memorable. And there are also magical items like Lisping Fang, like the Book of Dark Fates, which have phenomenal power and can set a character on a particular trajectory in terms of the journey, but at the same time have some drawbacks and carry that with them. So that's something that's pretty common to DCC and that I love bringing into it. The other thing is, and I think that this is particularly important when we're talking about philosophy, because philosophy, as you say, has many different qualities in terms of learning it properly, but having that, as Dad Thulu put it, external agency, or having that charitable extent of one's experience is so critical. I find that a lot of role-playing games engender a sort of main character syndrome where you don't want your character to die. Your character is your character. They act a certain way. Funnel Adventures, you don't have that problem. Like, you have 4 people, chances are one's going to die. They're all very fragile. And so you can't get attached to one perspective. You have to consider the perspectives of 4 different people. You can't just make them 4 different clones of the same person. They are different people. And so already the very nature of the DCC exercise is extending oneself outside not just your own avatar, but, to the little group of avatars, little family of avatars that you have to embody all these different perspectives. I think that that's what I like most about adapting it to DCC. Well, I would turn it around on you. What are some of the ways that you enjoyed developing it further for 5e, but also that you feel 5e serves this kind of approach?
Yeah. So one thing that, there were a few reasons that I picked Dungeons and Dragons for the course at the University of Calgary. It is, of course, one of the better known, perhaps the best known RPG sort of system. It pops up in pop culture all the time. But I do think that there is, so to sort of contrast it with DCC, I would say, feels like a much grittier, kind of desperate system, right? Where things can go bad really fast, and where you have that kind of tension. And I think that's a really fun way to play the game, right? To have that kind of like, oh man, we could really, if we fail to strategize appropriately, as you were kind of saying in your last couple of modules, especially in Tale of Two Sisters, things can go badly. Players can make some pretty huge mistakes. One thing that I think is helpful, and that one reason I wanted to use 5e is that I feel that it's a little more forgiving in terms of especially first-time students,
Right.
First-time players playing the game, making mistakes, and so keeping the emphasis on, you're going to go through this kind of adventure, and it's going to have kind of it's dangerous. You're going to feel some tension. You're going to feel threatened. The fights are going to be challenging, but it's a little more lighthearted, a little bit more of a like classic romp rather than, oh man, we are like moments from death here. and also giving them that space of feeling safe, a little bit safer,
Right.
to take the time to have those philosophical discussions. I will note, and I think this is fun too, some of the moral character of the discussions change between whether you have it in the DCC setting where everything is an intense threat at 0 level.
Right.
And if you start at level 1, right, in 5e, it came up in the discussion of one of the scenarios about whether there's a credible threat of violence being presented, because you are first level characters who have some competency.
Right.
And I don't want to give away, spoilers or anything, but that difference in sort of between a 0 level, character approaching this as a funnel adventure and a first level character who is maybe untested but has some basic competence does change the flavor of the engagement, the footing you're on. If you say engage the enemies or the NPCs in conversation, in trying to negotiate or bargain, or it does, I think it's going to change things a little bit. And so I think it's interesting also to get that perspective. Now, another thing I do like about having one particular character, and of course you get that in DCC as well after the funnel, is I do like to ask, and this is also just a general thing that's great, I think, about playing philosophy, playing D&D to learn philosophy, or any RPG to learn philosophy, is you can ask your students about, well, what's the difference in reasoning between why your character would have taken that action? Do you think that that's the right action to take? Even that, right, you've decided that your character would do this.
Right.
How do you engage with that? Do you think that was a good course of action? And it's always fun, especially to see this happen between veteran players who, have been playing for a while. Newer players often will make characters who are a little bit like themselves, or tend to more. Sometimes they go radically different and are like, I've made this drastically different character for myself. But it's really fun to get into those differences in your students, their player characters, the difference, the bleed, and also giving them another thing that's talked about alongside bleed is alibi, right? That notion that this is what my character would do, and asking students to all take seriously and engage the reasoning that your character might go through, and then later analyzing that in terms of moral philosophy and from your student's perspective is really fun.
Oh, I do love some alibi. That is my favorite. I will say, in my defense, I am not one of those lunatics that uses alibi just to act like a complete psychotic and run through the world just slaughtering people. I would rather use alibi to explore a different moral structure, a different structure of right and wrong. And I wouldn't even, and this is Matt Funk speaking, consider it to be inherently good or evil most of the time. I have played evil characters on occasion. I actually find they're kind of boring because they tend to be disruptive to the party, especially if played right. But I have played callous characters that only care about one particular code. And I think that to go back to our point about like the banality of evil is an interesting perspective to explore for me. This speaks to one of the questions that we had in chat from Nicole. She asked, and this is posed to you, whether running this in a formal class and running it at GenCon was different or the same. Namely, did GenCon players get interested in the philosophy part?
Yeah, so people have definitely been interested in kind of learning a bit about the philosophy. I will say, so the questions that come out of the game get asked in the talk at GenCon, and so people are interested, in addition to just learning how to play, how to run a game for learning purposes. They're also just interested in learning the material itself, in getting a little bit of information and education about philosophy. So they kind of want to know, like,
Right.
okay, so tell me about the difference between these moral theories and how they play into the decisions that players make in the game. Tell me a little bit about the different positions in the free will debate and how those come out in the game, and how those are connected to, say, assessments of moral responsibility
Right.
that may have to get, decided and figured out at the end after they've, decided, is this person, did this person act freely? And does that mean they were also morally responsible for their action? And so what does that mean for us and how we treat them in response to the things they've done? And so I would say that, yeah, people are genuinely curious about the philosophical aspects. And I think that's another thing that's really fun about this, is while it, was developed originally as a way to teach philosophy to students in a university setting for that sort of specific purpose, I think it also is a great way to kind of get or do some kind of popular philosophy, in a sense. That is, bring it to that popular audience and get people interested in it, and in a way that is asking them to engage with primary sources, right? And you get to do that with with old John Stuart's Mill. It's got some excerpts from Mill and Immanuel Kant as well, to provide the deontologist counterpoint to Mill's consequentialist utilitarianism. And so you can get your players those resources, get them to check it out, and I've got some explanatory notes to help clarify some of the archaic language.
Yes.
And then you get to talk about what makes an action right in a way that lots of people in their daily lives, I think, aren't used to doing, aren't used to thinking about moral actions in those specific terms.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to mention the various scholarly notes, or the ways that you introduce the works, because not that consequentialist utilitarianism doesn't roll right off the tongue for most people, but you do teach it in a way in the text that's quite accessible. It's not a graduate level understanding that's required to read this. Even your garden variety game master would be able to open this up and be able to understand, oh, well, okay, that's a deontological argument, and that's a consequentialist argument, and to start to frame thinking within that context, which is very exciting. And one thing I would say, considering we're coming up on time, we've got, drum roll, about 15 minutes to go. We have one philosophical question or conundrum that's coming up that disturbs everybody when I explained it to them, and that is the trolley problem. AKA,
yes.
in not this next module, but the module after, the dragon problem. Explain to me what the trolley problem is, and I think people will understand what we're going to do in terms of the dragon problem.
Yeah. So, the trolley problem, as originally proposed, I believe, by Philippa Foot, involves a trolley out of control hurtling down a track. You, as a person on the trolley, who could throw a switch to divert it onto another track. Now, on the track it's currently on, down that track, there are 5 people, workers, let's say, on the track who are doing some maintenance, but it's a raised track and there's no way for them to escape. If the trolley continues down its path, it will strike them and they will die. If the switch is pulled by the trolley driver, the trolley will be diverted onto a separate track, which contains but one worker, right? The question is, the basic question here is, do you throw the switch? Should the trolley driver throw the switch? Now, of course, there are consequentialist and deontological arguments that can be made. We might reason very straightforwardly on the consequentialist principle that we want the best possible outcome, that it's better to sacrifice one life instead of 5. Kant's deontological morality suggests that people ought not be treated as mere means, that people have inherent worth, and that by pulling the switch, you thereby cause the trolley to threaten one person who otherwise wouldn't have been harmed at all. And perhaps that is a violation of this principle of treating someone as a mere means. But, and here's the thing that the different scenarios in the dragon problem we'll get into, that's the basic trolley problem. But there is another aspect of this debate. That's what Judith Jarvis Thomson, another philosopher, calls the real trolley problem. Okay, because while there can be debate, certainly, about what the right course of action is in the trolley problem, many people find it at the very least acceptable that you pull the switch, sacrifice one life, and save the 5. Many people find that quite acceptable. But Thomson raises the following issue and says, well, imagine you're a surgeon. You're the best surgeon in the world. You have no errors. You never make errors. You know exactly what you're doing. You can do it perfectly.
Yes.
And you have 5 patients. One unfortunate patient is suffering from heart disease. One has lung cancer. One has renal failure and needs new kidneys. Each person requires, you have 5 people, each one requires a different organ. And you happen to know you have one extremely healthy patient who has perfectly compatible organs with all of those 5 other people. And you think to yourself, well, I could get that person. I could anesthetize them under some false pretense. I could remove their organs, and in doing so, I could save my 5 other patients from certain death. Thomson says most of our intuitive moral reaction to this is absolutely not. You cannot do that, surgeon. You cannot operate on a person and remove their organs to save 5 other people. And so Thomson, in her classic article on the trolley problem, asks, why are those 2 cases different? Why do we find it, in general, again, people have different intuitions, but most people, or at least many people, think that it's quite acceptable to turn the lever, pull the switch in the trolley, turn it to sacrifice 1 to save 5. But in the surgeon scenario, we balk. We say, no, something's gone wrong here. Something doesn't seem right. Something doesn't gel with our intuitions. And so I won't get into much more detail about this here, but that is what Thomson says is sort of the real trolley problem. And the essential point that's being put forth and explored is, why does consequentialist reasoning seem to be okay in some cases, but not in others?
Right.
And that is, so there's the basic trolley problem, and then what Thomson calls the real trolley problem. And the dragon problem will give educators and interested gamers a chance to delve into both of those questions.
Yes, brilliant. So, given that we have mere minutes, we've talked about the dragon problem. We've touched some on what's coming up in terms of the questions around identity that arise in the second module. Can you give us hints at what else is in store in terms of the course of the Witch is Weird?
Yeah. So I guess, so we're going to do some moral philosophy in our first adventure. The second adventure, we're going to do tackle some of those personal identity issues and what counts as surviving death, if it's possible to survive death. we'll do the dragon problem in the third adventure, and then the fourth adventure. The title of it, or at least the working title, is Night of the White Wolf. And it is going to ask students to engage with questions of free will. And there is a nice little analog for being in a state in which you might not be in full control of yourself, and that is being a lycanthrope in Dungeons and Dragons. And so we're going to use that handy little fantasy trope as a way to explore what it means to be in control of your actions and what it means to be responsible for your actions as players struggle to determine what they ought to do with a werewolf that has infiltrated the town.
Indeed. And I think one thing that I really look forward to as we develop these is being able to poll the backers as to what some of the backer exclusive or early backer exclusive offerings for the future works will be. Because right now, you and I feel, have created within the framework of our understanding and our collaboration, a pretty successful product, a really exciting experience. It's got all the hallmarks of what people love from D&D and from 5e. We haven't even touched on the Warlock subclass yet, which I thought was a brilliant offering on your part. And it has what people would expect out of Witch Pleas Publishing. It's got the scholarship element that's accessible. It's got the campaign settings. It's got sort of that richer world that game masters and players can expand upon and that larger story. But at the same time, we've yet to hear what really resonates with what educators want out of the works on a broader sense, what additional materials we could bring into it. So I think we have this wonderful skeleton of a narrative that we're fleshing out together, and that the limbs of that and the additional elements will really come from the crowd. I, for one, am excited to hear what the polls say.
Yeah, it's there are all sorts of things that are possible. We could put together some supplemental. I have tons of teaching materials that I use for the course. Maybe instructors want access to some of those, to get some of those and get some help in, not just having the adventure and the philosophical reading and essay present there that they can give to their students, but maybe also some help for the instructor who wants to run the class and things like, those timetables I was referencing earlier, discussion questions that I use in my class. There are all sorts of things that I think could be really fun to provide to make this an even more tempting product for educators. And some of those things could work well as so suppose I can imagine someone running this campaign, The Witch is Weird, and also doing a little reading and discussion group on top of it. So you can use some of those things for that if you wanted to, if you want to philosophically enrich your life as I hope you do.
Absolutely. And I think that another approach, especially towards the end of the series, might be, in essence, to have a philosophical primer, a book that, in essence, has the various schools of philosophy and then lists of the various problems. We have, of course, introduced, like we said earlier, these various little elements and encounters. But even in a broader sense, providing adventure hooks or concepts that game masters can weave into their homebrew campaigns, or even like an established campaign setting, would be pretty cool to offer. But we will see what the crowd says. I will say in the closing minutes, I would love to hear some on your Warlock subclass.
Oh, yes. So I was looking for something, fun to add, especially for that 5e version. And one of my favorite classes is the Warlock. I love the idea of kind of this exchange of service or making a bargain for power, and the motivations, the desperation that can drive someone to do that. I just picked up a book on the history of the Faustian bargain in literature, so I'm excited to dig into that. But it's something that's fascinated me for a long time. In this game, you'll find that one of the recurring themes is fate. It plays into the theme of free will as well. You know, if you want to think about fate, if you want to think about how material circumstances determine our actions, however you like to approach it, the entity that the warlock in this new subclass can make a pact with is fate itself, or the three fates in the world of lore. However you'd like to kind of adapt it, I encourage you to set it in lore because it's a cool world, but there are all sorts of gods of fate, or the very concept of fate itself that the warlock could make a pact or a bargain with. And what it gives you the ability to do is manipulate, pull on those strands of the tapestry of fate, as it's often sort of referred to in a literary way, to benefit yourself, potentially cause a little misfortune for others, but always, and I think this is lovely because sometimes I think the warlock bargains or the warlock pacts don't give you enough sense that you're making a trade. And so some of these fate abilities are really cool in that they let you bend fate a little bit, but a price always comes due, and an advantage now may mean a disadvantage later. And so I think it's especially fun to have that mechanic in play as a player to add some additional tension and excitement, and to really get that sense that you're making a bargain, a trade with your pact entity.
Yeah, could not agree with you more on that one, Archie. Well, I feel like we're at time now, so I would say in terms of my closing comments, thank you for all those that turned out. I'm very delighted with the number of views and participants that we got out of this. I look forward to seeing that manifest in bringing this awesome first installment of The Witch is Weird to life and to launching this thrilling campaign. Anything that you'd leave the audience with?
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for coming and joining us for the launch party. Thank you, Matt, for organizing, hosting, providing some great questions to give me the opportunity to talk a bit about the philosophy, the process of teaching. It's all been so very fun, and I really do hope that educators and gamers find this and have a blast teaching their students with RPGs, or if you're not a philosophy instructor, learning some philosophy while having a whole lot of fun having an adventure.
Well, you got it. Well, over the next 30 days, because it ends on July 17th, I'm going to be doing all I can to extend it to people, make them aware of it, introduce it. I know the same goes for many of our committed backers. Thank you all for that. With that, it is 11/11, and so the campaign has launched. We will see you later, and probably on another live stream. This was fun.
This was fun. I had a really good time, so I will look forward to doing another of these again in the future.
You got it. Farewell for now, folks.